the same.
As the bodies of Anthony and Michael Spilatro were finally released by authorities, the families of the reputed mobsters learned that the Chicago Archdiocese has forbidden a public church funeral.
Mr. Spilatro's death now leaves the alleged overseer of Las Vegas the spot vacant.
We were trying to get him to introduce me to his brother, so that because his brother had a better end than he did with the associates, and that was our target, was his brother, but of course that fell apart.
To understand why Vegas Metro went so hard after Larry, the first question I had to answer was simple. Was his brother Tommy really the mob soldier police claimed he was? So I had a plan. Step 1, book a flight to Reagan National in DC. From there, I'd get lost trying to find the right subway platform. Then it'd be about a 35-minute train ride to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, where I'd find the transcripts of a big trial that took place a few years after Larry's ordeal. These transcripts would be a great example of the overreach and defamatory tactics that the government used in their pursuit of Tommy. Finally, after a long 24 hours, I'd get home and take my dog Chili for a long walk through Buffalo's west side. The same streets that Tommy and Larry had walked as kids. The streets that actually shaped their lives. I just wanted to find out what kind of person Tommy was. Just the basics, just to give this episode some context. It ended up being a good thing because he's actually a really hard guy to learn about. All the articles and the news footage I dug up, the documentaries, even with access to the National Archives, the entire catalog from the FBI and DOJ records. There just isn't that much out there about him beyond the company he kept and the crimes he allegedly committed. To be honest, I found it strange how after so many years of surveillance, the government had so little to report about a man they claimed was a high-ranking member of an organized crime family. I do know that when Tommy was a kid, in the 50s, the Buffalo mob was at its peak strength. Referred to by the FBI as, quote, the arm, it was one of the most influential mafia families of that time. Buffalo was a manufacturing powerhouse back then, with one of the highest per capita incomes in the country. And that prosperous, union-heavy economy was perfect for organized crime. And the West Side neighborhood that the Palermos called home was its power base. But Tommy's parents were considered more working class and straight-laced. They represented a stark contrast to the world around them. By all accounts, Thomas Palermo Sr. was a humble and respected man of high moral character, who valued hard work above all else. But even he couldn't escape the reality of his surroundings. He owned and operated a small neighborhood lounge, no more than a few blocks from home. I've walked past the site where it once stood, and even today, it looks exactly like the kind of place you've seen 1,000 times in mob movies, with local wise guys and hoodlums filing in and out at will, and commandeering the back of the room to talk business over comped meals. Though not strict, his parents could definitely be considered guarded, kind of careful of her children's influences. When he was 12, Tommy's mother started dressing him in high-waisted trousers and suspenders to try to keep him away from the wrong crowd of school. It didn't work. In 7th grade, he had a side hustle, dropping betting slips off at barbershops and corner stores on his paper route for neighborhood bookies. After a while, his classmates came to him for loans. Throughout high school and into his 20s, while most of his friends were preoccupied with angling for the attention of neighborhood tough guys, Tommy's free time was appropriated by his father, who put him to work learning the restaurant business. He started at the bottom, washing dishes, emptying ashtrays, until at 25, it became his. Then one night, with a large bachelor party in full swing, the FBI and state police raided the lounge. Inside was a who's who of alleged top Buffalo Mafia brass, 37 men were taken into custody. State police actually had to borrow an extra paddy wagon from the Buffalo PD to fit everybody. The fallout was swift. New York revoked Tommy's liquor license, and Palermo's lounge was shut down for good. There would be no cushy landing. Law enforcement and media scrutiny would serve as something as a motif from here on out, a tangible presence that would shape perception of the Palermo name to this day. These details were actually pretty hard to find. What was far less difficult to learn about was the undercover investigation that resulted in Tommy being charged with extortion and murder of a Vegas loan shark named Herbie Blitzstein. For episode 2, I'm going to tell you about how, despite the trap they set for Larry blowing up in their face, a federal judge ruling they had committed outrageous misconduct and being sued for millions, Vegas Metro wasn't done going after Tommy. In fact, they doubled down. And this time they came armed, with the full weight of the FBI and every investigative weapon in the government's arsenal at their disposal. They called it Operation Thin Crust. I'm Brad Rocci from Scuffletown. This is Lucky Larry, Episode 2, Big Brother.
Traditional organized crime activities in Las Vegas centered around the casino skim were largely eliminated by the mid-'80s through a combination of local and federal law enforcement. But there were still some remnants. Herbert Fat Herbie Blitzstein was best known as a friend and associate of the notorious Tony the Ant Spilotro. Blitzstein was found shot to death in his Las Vegas townhome.
Officers working in teams of 3 swiftly worked simultaneously to arrest 28 people.
These Buffalo and LA mobsters were behind Blitzstein's murder, and they just wanted to take over his illegal rackets in Las Vegas.
The year was 1994. 60-year-old John Bronco walked into the FBI's Las Vegas field office and asked to speak with the special agent in charge, Bobby Siller. Bronco was a career criminal, an alleged enforcer for the Milano family in Los Angeles. A few weeks prior, he was picked up in Vegas on kidnapping and robbery charges after trying to shake down the owner of an escort service. And now here he was, offering his services as an informant to avoid another stint in prison. Bronco had been well known to the FBI for years by this point. After his latest arrest, Siller had a feeling it was only a matter of time before he came looking to make a deal. Siller knew Bronco had the potential to be a huge get for the FBI. They'd been trying to strike deep into the heart of the LA mafia for a while, and Bronco had the credibility and connections to penetrate the well-insulated leadership. But not long into Bronco's debriefing, agents began sensing that some of the information he was passing on was exaggerated at best. Within a couple hours, Siller was informed that Bronco had outright lied more than once. Siller stood up and ended the meeting on the spot, and informed Bronco and his attorney that there would be no deal. And then Bronco told them something that would end up making him one of the FBI's most valuable mafia informants since Henry Hill. He said he heard about a few guys from the Buffalo and Los Angeles families who were talking about muscling Herbie Blitzstein out of his loan sharking operation. Fat Herbie, as he was known, was a Vegas legend. He had been around for so long, even the cops respected him. He was Tony Spilatro's right-hand man in the 70s and 80s, when Spilotro ran the city for the Chicago outfit. Fat Herbie was a big part of the hole-in-the-wall gang, Spilatro's ring of crooks, made famous in the movie Casino.
They were very careful. They always bypassed the alarms, or else, if not, they drilled enough holes to knock through the walls with a sledgehammer.
By all accounts, Fat Herbie was one of the biggest loan sharks in Vegas in 1994. He had only been out of prison for a few months, but he had almost had $250,000 on the street. He was convicted in '86 for taking part in a credit card scam. But now with Spilotro dead, Fat Herbie no longer had the city's most feared overseer watching his back. And whether or not he realized it, he had nowhere to run anymore. Bronco was back on the street as a paid informant without missing a single phone call. Special Agent Siller, gave orders to provide Bronco with every available investigative weapon at the FBI's disposal. At Bronco's request, they leased a small commercial space on South Valley View Boulevard and turned it into a social club. Bronco knew that if there was one thing every wise guy in the world loved, it was a safe place to sit around all day and talk about their scams. They called it the Sea Breeze, and Bronco was put in place as the club's owner and proprietor of record. Bronco's Sea Breeze Social Club was barely more than a 20 by 20 room with a TV, a table, and an old stove where Bronco would cook for everybody. And word got around fast. Night and day, the Sea Breeze was busy with a who's who of mobsters from various families operating in Vegas. And the FBI had it wired inside and out. They knew everyone who went in and everything they said while they were there. It was an information goldmine. The feds were acquiring more info than they could possibly handle. It got to be so big, they had to bring in more agents and Vegas Metro just to help sort through all the recordings. But at the same time, Bronco wasn't living up to his end of the agreement. His deal was reliant upon his ability to obtain evidence of a conspiracy to extort Fat Herbie. But months into the operation, he hadn't produced any results. But the Blitzstein scheme resurfaced during a dinner at the Mediterranean Room at the Gold Coast. Bronco was able to record a conversation with associates of the Buffalo and LA families. It started with everyone complaining that Blitzstein, who was a Jew, was being allowed to operate with impunity. But it quickly turned into a sanctioned plot to force Fat Herbie to hand over his lucrative auto repair service and all of his loan sharking operations. Fat Herbie's fate was sealed when a few days later, one of the men present at the Gold Coast, Peter Caruso, told Bronco the plan had been changed. Not only was Blitzstein going to be forced out of business, but now his home was going to be robbed as well. Fat Herbie was famous for bragging about the cache of spoils left over from the hole-in-the-wall gang burglaries that he was still holding on to. He said he had 25 pounds of gold and a 9-carat diamond worth over $100,000, stolen from the Bel Air home of Mario Malieri, the famous owner of the Whiskey A Go-Go nightclub. Bronco was a seasoned gangster, and he knew that if Blitzstein resisted, he'd be killed. Peter Caruso was a heavy-set, 55-year-old Milano family associate, referred to by the FBI as a one-man crime wave. He achieved some Hollywood notoriety back in the 80s after pulling off a Highline burglary while in the middle of a massive heart attack. He was called, quote, the kind of gangster who would wake up every morning and figure out who he was going to rob before he finished his first cup of coffee, end quote. With Bronco and Caruso, the others present at the Gold Coast meeting were Carmen Milano, brother of Peter Milano, the alleged boss of LA's family, and Joe Luca, a Chicago outfit associate and one-time partner of Fat Herbie's. At trial, Luca testified that he was reluctant to be part of the plot to rob and extort Fat Herbie. And technically, he told the truth. He definitely made his disapproval known, but it was all pretense. Because in the pre-trial phase, it came out that Luca had been an informant from the very beginning, just like Bronco. The whole time, the FBI had been secretly using the two as stopgaps for one another, so they could make sure the information each man was passing on to them was true. Neither had any idea the other was cooperating with the government. But if the whole point of the operation was to secure charges against those involved in the plot, why have one of their cooperating witnesses openly try to stop it from happening? Well, that depends on who you ask, and where Tommy comes into the story. The appellate brief in Tommy's case says Luca began to fear he was going to be targeted for voicing his objection to the plot, and then reached out to Palermo for protection. It goes on to say that upon being told of the coming extortion, Palermo injected himself into the plan and expressed his intention to take Blitzstein's loan sharking operation all for himself. But under cross-examination, Luca admitted that when made aware of the coinciding robbery, Palermo was emphatic that neither Bronco, Luca, nor Caruso had the authority to harm Herbie in any way whatsoever. Bronco even corroborated Luca's testimony. But the day after Blitzstein's body was found, with 2 bullets in his face and 1 in the back of his head, Bronco recorded Tommy telling him to compile a list of the names of those who had outstanding loans owed to Herbie. As instructed, Bronco gave the list, with loans totaling over $247,000 to Tommy. Just over 3 months later, a federal grand jury voted to indict Tommy on over 40 counts, including murder, conspiracy, and extortion, citing Bronco's recording as evidence that Tommy, quote, sanctioned Fat Herbie's killing. But what the FBI failed to disclose was the fact that they knew Tommy was never made aware of any murder plot, and even took it upon himself to meet with Fat Herbie personally to tell him that he would be forced out of business, but no harm would come to him. The oversight will go on to prove costly to the government's case. Here's how Fat Herbie's murder went down. January 6th, 1995, 4 p.m. Lucas showed up unannounced at Herbie's repair shop. They hadn't spoken since their falling out, back before Herbie went to prison. Luca parked his car and pulled off the wire he'd been told to wear and stuffed it under his seat. Luca claimed they spoke briefly, and Herbie confirmed that he had been reassured by Tommy no physical harm would come to him. The two then shook hands before parting, and Luca told him he should still watch his back. Simultaneously, Peter Caruso, with Antoine Davey and Richard Freeman, 2 small-time crooks known best for robbing area drug dealers, were in the midst of looting Blitzstein's house at 3655 Mount Vernon Avenue. Davey and Friedman were then supplied with 2 guns, a .22 and a .38, and told by Caruso to stay and wait for Herbie. 6 p.m. Antoine Davey was coming out of the first-floor bathroom when Blitzstein walked in. Friedman emerged from a closet and fired 1 shot with the .22, hitting Herbie in the face. Antoine Davey testified that upon being shot, Blitzstein asked, quote, "Why me?" end quote. Friedman then tried to fire 1 more shot, but his gun jammed. When Davey handed Friedman the .38, Friedman fired 1 more shot into Blitzstein's face. Herbie fell to his knees, with his face and upper body resting on the seat of his black leather recliner. Friedman then fired 1 more shot into the back of his head. 7 p.m. Friedman and Davey left Blitzstein's house, and Friedman placed a call to Caruso to report, quote, "The party went well," end quote, the prearranged phrase meaning the murder had been accomplished. Friedman then bragged about shooting Blitzstein in the head because his body was still moving on the recliner. 7:30 p.m. 2 FBI agents conducted a spot check of Herbie's residence and noted no activity other than his car parked in the driveway. Special Agent Spiller would later have to justify his decision and not have Blitzstein under 24-hour observation, with the FBI already having the knowledge of a plot against Blitzstein's life. 10 p.m. Peter Caruso met with Friedman and Davey at his service station on West Sahara Avenue, where he paid them $3,000 each for their services. January 7th, 9 a.m. Bronco learned about Blitzstein's murder while meeting with Caruso at a Denny's restaurant. Bronco acted indifferent to the news, but right after the meeting, he called his handlers, who in turn reported directly to Special Agent Siller that they, quote, "might have a problem," end quote. 15 minutes later, agents checked with the Vegas Metro and learned a report of a homicide at Blitzstein's house had just been called in. Herbie's attorney would later file an unsuccessful civil suit for derogation of duty, claiming the FBI had an obligation to tell Blitzstein they had a reason to believe he was in danger. 10 a.m. Herbie's body is found by officers from Vegas Metro. The Clark County coroner later determines he had been dead for over 12 hours. January 8th. Bronco recorded a conversation between himself, Milano, Caruso, and Luca, where a plan was made to split Blitzstein's $247,000 in outstanding loans between the 4 of them. Tommy, it was agreed upon, was to get nothing. January 10th. Luca records a furious Tommy expressing his anger over what happened and telling Luca he wants nothing to do with Blitzstein's outstanding loans or his auto shop. January 23rd. The FBI asked Bronco to take on the assignment of trying to get Caruso to confess to the murder. On Bronco's last recorded conversation, he got Caruso to admit he gave the contract to Friedman and Davey for $6,000. And as a bonus, he told Bronco about a plan to burglarize the home of Horseshoe Hotel and Casino owner Ted Binion, Herbie's close friend, and have him murdered in the same manner. February 14th, Bronco and Luca were taken out of commission and secretly moved with their families into FBI-rented apartments out of town. On May 12th of 95, Peter Caruso, Carmen Milano, Anton Davey, Richard Friedman, and Tommy Palermo were all indicted. Peter Caruso died of a heart attack while awaiting trial. Milano, Davey, and Friedman were all convicted of murder and were sentenced in federal court to 15, 20, and 25 years. Tommy was the last to be tried, and his trial played out much differently. Like I said earlier, the FBI failed to disclose hundreds of pages of exculpatory evidence. Whether or not that was intentional, again, depends on who you ask. But to make matters worse, even the lead prosecutor acknowledged the fragility of the government's evidence. In his closing argument, he said, quote, "Sometimes when you open a sewer and look inside, you get a swan here or there," end quote. 3 hours was all it took for the jury to acquit Tommy of murder and every other count in his indictment except the very last one: conspiracy to interfere with interstate commerce by means of extortion. Tommy never took part in the planning of or benefited from the plot against Fat Herbie, yet he still received 7 years. The ruling was upheld under appeal, and with time served, he would spend just over 6.5 years in federal prison. To this day, it remains the only crime he has ever been convicted of. For Vegas Metro, watching the FBI pull off in a single year what they'd been trying to accomplish since the 80s was a hard pill to get down. For episode 3, we're diving back into Larry's story, starting on the night when the biggest mistake of his life almost became the only thing that could save it. That's next time on Lucky Larry. Lucky Larry comes from Scuffletown. It's hosted by me, Brad Rocci, and my dog, Chili. Go Bills.